Before we dive into today's eerie adventure, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any of our haunting stories. Welcome back to Past the Pumpkin's Glow. Let's dive right into our stories tonight. I had always considered myself fortunate to find such an affordable house in a quiet neighborhood. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, always waving and smiling. However, one house stood out like a sore thumb. It was the inn across the street, perpetually dark and shrouded in a sense of foreboding. No one ever seemed to go in or out, and I had never seen any lights on inside. One evening, as I was coming home late from work, I noticed a faint light flickering in the window of the mysterious house. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself walking towards it. As I got closer, I could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. I peered through the window, and my heart skipped a beat. An old man with pale, almost translucent skin was sitting at a table, tapping his fingers on the surface in a slow, deliberate pattern. He suddenly looked up, his eyes locking onto mine through the glass. Instinctively, I blinked. In that split second, the old man was suddenly right in front of the window, his face inches from mine, his fingers tapping on the glass with the same slow, deliberate rhythm. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and hurried back to my house. That night, I couldn't shake the image of his eyes, dark and empty, like two endless voids. The tapping sound seemed to echo in my mind, unrelenting. The next day, I asked around the neighborhood about the house. To my shock, I was told that it had been abandoned for years, ever since the previous owner, an old man, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Weeks went by, and I tried to put the unsettling encounter behind me. But every time I walked past that house, a sense of unease washed over me. One rainy evening, the power went out on our street. As I lit candles around my house, I glanced out the window and saw that the silent house was the only one with a faint glow coming from inside. I couldn't resist. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. The front door was ajar, creaking open with a gentle push. Inside, the house was a relic of the past, filled with dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing old photographs and paintings, their subjects staring back at me with hollow eyes. As I ventured further, I walked past the table I had seen through the window. The rhythmic tapping began again, this time right behind me. I spun around, but the table was empty. There was no sign of the old man. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned slowly, scanning the room. Suddenly, a flash of lightning lit up the room from outside. Standing by the window, the old man was tapping on the glass, his face illuminated in the stormy light. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through me. Panic surged through me, and I ran for the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. The door, thankfully, opened with ease, and I sprinted outside into the rain. As I emerged from the house, a police patrol car pulled up. The officer stepped out and approached me, his flashlight cutting through the rain. "Ma'am, what are you doing here? We've had a call about a trespasser on this property." Trying to compose myself and not sound like I was insane or on drugs, I replied. I noticed a flickering light in the house. It looked abandoned, and I was concerned someone might be inside needing help. The officer scrutinized me for a moment before asking for my identification. I handed him my license, which confirmed I lived just across the street. He gave me a warning, reminding me to leave abandoned properties alone and let the authorities handle such situations. Relieved, I thanked him and hurried back to my home, my mind still reeling from the night's events. Life slowly returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear the faint tapping sound in the dead of night. Months later, a new family moved into the house. I warned them about the house, but they laughed it off as a silly ghost story. One evening, I saw their young daughter standing in front of the silent house, staring at it with wide eyes. She turned to me and said, "The man inside says hello." A wave of dread hit me, and I realized that the house's secrets were far from being buried. The silent house would forever be a place of darkness and dread, its inhabitants doomed to repeat their eerie existence, waiting for the next curious soul to cross their threshold. I've lived in my neighborhood for over 20 years, and it was always a quiet, pleasant place to call home. That was until the old man next door, Mr. Harper, passed away. His house, once pristine and orderly, quickly fell into disrepair and chaos. His children moved in. 3 siblings, including one mentally handicapped brother, who spent most of his time riding his bike around the neighborhood. He seemed to avoid the house as much as possible, and now I understand why. The once well-kept home transformed into a trap house. People came and went at all hours of the day and night. The place was never quiet, and it wasn't long before the sheriff's department and even the DEA showed up, trying to make arrests. Strangely, every time they arrived, the people they were looking for had vanished, as if tipped off. We started suspecting someone in law enforcement might be on their payroll. The house was a hub of rowdy activity. Fires blazed high enough to lick the trees above the fence line. Screams and fights, especially between a man and a woman, were common. We could hear the shouting, the breaking of glass, and occasionally unsettling silences. One night around midnight, our doorbell rang. I opened the door to find 2 sheriff's deputies standing there, looking concerned. They explained they had received a call from our property. Someone had whispered, "Help me," repeatedly. I assured them no one from our house had made the call and suggested it might have come from the neighbors, considering the kind of activities that went on there. They took notes and left, but the incident left me uneasy. A few weeks later, around 3 or 4 a.m., I woke up to a bright light shining into our house. Groggy and disoriented, I went to the window and saw black cars I'd never seen before parked in front of the neighbor's house. They had set up powerful lights that illuminated their yard, but the light also flooded into my home. I watched through the window as shadows moved frantically in the yard. I checked my security camera, hoping for a clearer view. The footage was grainy, and the dense foliage obscured much of the action. But in the moments when the wind shifted the leaves, I saw the neighbors digging. They seemed to be raking the ground or hiding something. It was impossible to make out exactly what they were doing, but it was an odd activity for that time of night. Morning came and the cars and the lights were gone. The yard looked as chaotic as ever, with no obvious signs of what had transpired just hours before. I never did find out what they were doing that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. It felt like something out of a crime drama, too surreal to be happening in my quiet little neighborhood. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring out the window, half expecting to see those lights again. The neighbors still live there, and the house remains a hotbed of suspicious activity. The mentally handicapped brother still rides his bike around the neighborhood, perhaps trying to escape the madness inside. The rest of us stay vigilant, waiting for the day when the cockroaches next door get caught. Let me tell you about the time we bought this beautiful house way out in the country. My wife Emily and I had always dreamed of a place where we could raise our kids with plenty of space to roam. When we found this old farmhouse sitting on a few acres of wooded land, it seemed perfect. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that you could barely see their lights at night, and the peace and quiet were exactly what we wanted. The first few weeks were idyllic. We spent our days unpacking and exploring the property with the kids, and our nights enjoying the stars and the sounds of nature. It was a dream come true. But then, things took a turn for the strange. One evening, after we'd finally gotten the kids to bed, Emily and I decided to relax on the back patio with a couple of drinks. The night was clear, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was so serene that it took me a moment to notice the movement in the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal. Living out in the country, you get used to seeing deer and other wildlife, so I didn't think much of it. But then I saw another shadow, and this one was definitely bipedal. I stood up, squinting into the darkness, trying to get a better look. "Hey, I see you. Get off my property," I shouted, my voice cutting through the night. There was a pause, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of leaves rustling from multiple locations. It wasn't just one or two people out there. It sounded like 5 or 6. And then came the laughter. Men and women echoing through the trees. It was chilling, and I couldn't tell which direction they ran, but it was definitely deeper into the woods. Emily and I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to process what we'd just experienced. Eventually, we went back inside, locking all the doors and windows. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The next few days were tense. We kept an eye on the woods, but everything seemed normal during the day. It was at night that things got weird. We'd hear footsteps around the house, whispers we couldn't quite make out. And once, someone even knocked on the back door. But when I opened it, no one was there. I decided I couldn't just sit around and do nothing. One afternoon, I grabbed my old hunting rifle and told Emily I was going to take a walk through the woods. She wasn't thrilled about the idea, but she understood. I had to know what was out there. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around me, and the light grew dim. After about half an hour, I stumbled across a small, makeshift cabin. It looked like it had been thrown together with whatever materials were at hand: old wood, tarps, and corrugated metal. I approached cautiously, peering through one of the dirty makeshift windows. That's when I saw them, eyes staring back at me from the darkness inside the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, from inside, I heard a voice shout, "Run!" Before I could react, 6 people bolted from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. They were gone as quickly as they had appeared. I stood there for a moment, stunned, then turned and hurried back to the house to call the cops. When the police arrived, they searched the area and confirmed what I'd seen. The cabin was a spot where squatters or transients had been living. They found remnants of campfires, old blankets, and other signs of habitation. It looked like these people had been staying there for a while, maybe even before we bought the property. The police told us that the squatters were likely aware of the sale and had been forced out. They probably came back to try and reclaim their spot or to scare us away. The good news was that they didn't seem dangerous, just desperate. The officers assured us they'd keep an eye on the area, but they didn't think the squatters would come back. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to normal. The strange noises stopped, and we didn't see any more shadows in the woods. But the excitement we'd felt about our new home was definitely tarnished. Every time I walked through the woods or sat out on the back patio, I couldn't help but think about those eyes staring back at me from the cabin. Despite everything, we still love our house. The kids have plenty of space to play, and the peace and quiet we originally sought are still there, most of the time. But there's always that lingering unease, that sense of the unknown lurking just beyond the tree line. So if you ever find yourself buying a house way out in the country, be prepared for anything. The isolation that seems so appealing can also bring unexpected surprises. And if you ever see shadows moving in the woods, don't ignore them. Trust your instincts and stay safe, because you never really know what or who might be out there. You know how you expect your neighbors to be normal, maybe even a bit boring? That's what I thought when Bob moved in next door. He seemed like a decent guy, middle-aged, quiet, kept to himself mostly. We exchanged pleasantries now and then, but nothing beyond that. I didn't think much of him until I started noticing his obsession with photography. At first, it was just the occasional click of a camera when I was outside. I assumed he was into nature photography or something harmless like that. But then I noticed him pointing the camera toward my house more and more often. He'd be out there early in the morning, late at night, even in the rain. It started to feel intrusive, like he was watching us. One Saturday, I decided to confront him. I went over and asked what he was doing. Bob just smiled and said he was an amateur photographer, capturing the beauty of the neighborhood. His explanation seemed innocent enough, but something about his demeanor put me on edge. He had this way of smiling without it reaching his eyes. Then things got stranger. I began finding photos in my mailbox, pictures of my house, my garden, my family. There were close-ups of my kids playing in the yard, my wife reading on the porch, even me washing the car. The angles were weird, almost as if they were taken from within my property. It creeped me out. One night I heard a noise outside. I looked out the window and saw Bob in my backyard, his camera aimed at my bedroom window. I shouted at him, and he ran off. The next morning, I found more photos, slipped under my door this time. They were all of us inside the house, taken through the windows. My family was terrified. I called the police and showed them the photos. They talked to Bob, but he claimed it was all a misunderstanding. He said he was sorry and promised it wouldn't happen again. The police couldn't do much without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, so they let him off with a warning. After that, Bob seemed to disappear. We didn't see him outside, and the photo deliveries stopped. I hoped it was over, but the sense of being watched never left. I installed security cameras around the house for peace of mind. A few weeks later, my wife found a hidden camera in our garden, pointed directly at our house. It was well concealed, but she spotted it while gardening. We checked the security footage and saw Bob sneaking into our yard at night, placing the camera. I called the police again, and this time they had enough to act. They searched Bob's house and found hundreds of photos of us. He had an entire room dedicated to his collection. There were pictures, surveillance equipment, and notebooks filled with notes about our daily routines. It was horrifying. Bob was arrested and charged with stalking and invasion of privacy. We got a restraining order, and he eventually moved away. But the damage was done. My family never felt completely safe in our own home again. We ended up moving a few months later, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. Even now, I'm always wary of the neighbors. I can't help but wonder who might be watching, lurking behind a camera lens. It's a reminder that sometimes the quiet, unassuming people next door might be hiding something far more sinister. Hey, I've got a pretty nasty story about my old neighbor. I used to live in this small apartment building, and my neighbor was this middle-aged guy who always seemed kind of off. He kept to himself mostly, but sometimes I'd see him bringing in these big boxes. He never said much, just a nod or a grunt if we passed each other in the hallway. The boxes he carried looked heavy, and I often wondered what he was up to, but I figured it was none of my business. One day I noticed this weird smell coming from his apartment, like something was rotting. At first, I thought maybe he'd just forgotten to take out his trash, but the smell didn't go away. It lingered in the hallway, creeping into my apartment. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would eventually dissipate, but then I started seeing bugs. At first, it was just a few cockroaches, but then there were more. They were everywhere. In my kitchen, my bathroom, even my bed, it was disgusting. I complained to the landlord, and they sent an exterminator. The exterminator came, sprayed the place down, and assured me the problem would be solved. But the bugs kept coming. No matter how clean I kept my apartment or how many traps I set, they just kept multiplying. I decided to confront my neighbor about it, but when I knocked on his door, he didn't answer. I could hear movement inside, so I knew he was home. I knocked again, louder this time, but he still didn't respond. A few nights later, I woke up to this scratching noise. It was coming from the walls. I banged on the wall, and it stopped, but then I heard it again, coming from my neighbor's apartment. It was like something was crawling inside the walls, scratching and scuttling around. I called the landlord again, and they finally agreed to check it out. The next day, the landlord and a maintenance guy went to my neighbor's apartment. They knocked, but there was no answer. Eventually, they used a master key to get inside. What they found was beyond anything I could have imagined. The place was infested. There were roaches, spiders, and all sorts of creepy crawlies everywhere. The smell was even worse inside, a sickening, rancid odor that made you gag as soon as you stepped through the door. The landlord found my neighbor in his bedroom, surrounded by jars of insects. He had been breeding them and releasing them into the building. The jars were filled with roaches, beetles, spiders, and other bugs I couldn't even identify. There were cages with rats and other small animals, all alive and crawling with insects. The scratching noises I'd heard were the bugs and rats moving through the walls, spreading throughout the building. The landlord evicted him immediately, and they had to fumigate the entire building. The exterminators came back, this time with heavy-duty equipment. They set off foggers, sprayed every inch of the place, and tore out sections of the walls to get rid of nests and burrows. It took weeks to get rid of all the bugs. The smell lingered too, despite the thorough cleaning. During the fumigation process, I had to stay with a friend. When I finally returned to my apartment, it felt different. Cleaner, yes, but also tainted. I couldn't shake the memory of those bugs crawling all over me, invading my space. I'd lie in bed at night feeling phantom itches, convinced that a roach or spider was crawling up my leg. I started having nightmares about the bugs. In my dreams, they were everywhere, swarming over my body, covering my walls, filling my mouth and ears. I'd wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat, and spend the rest of the night checking every corner of my apartment for signs of infestation. I moved out not long after. I couldn't stand living there anymore, knowing what had happened. Even though the new place was bug-free, I still found myself constantly checking for insects, jumping at every tiny movement or speck of dust. The experience had left me paranoid and uneasy. To this day, the memory of those bugs crawling all over me still makes my skin crawl. I've developed a bit of an obsession with cleanliness and pest control. My friends tease me about it, but they don't understand. They didn't live through it. They didn't see the jars of insects or hear the scratching in the walls. They didn't feel the bugs crawling over their skin. It's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Thanks for tuning in to Past the Pumpkin's Glow. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell so you won't miss any of our chilling tales. Curious for more creepy tales? Don't just listen to the shadows, join our community of the brave and the bold. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and ring the bell to never miss out on our allegedly true scary stories. Have your own ghostly encounters, sinister sightings, or otherwise scary event? Drop us a comment below. We're dying to hear from you.